Since Japan's asset bubble burst in 1991, the country has suffered through nearly 3 decades of economic stagnation, persistent deflation, and sluggish growth. So, what really caused this prolonged downturn? One of the most influential explanations is balance sheet recession theory. It's a compelling explanation, but only up to a point. While it does a great job explaining the painful deleveraging that followed the crash, it struggles to explain why Japan remained trapped in stagnation for almost 30 years. If balance sheet repair was only a temporary process, why did the economy fail to recover for decades? Another explanation points to Japan's demographic crisis. In my previous video, I introduced a single variable that I believe captures this relationship directly: working age population, or WAP. Using historical data, I showed that changes in WAP closely track changes in China's economic growth. Based on this framework, I argued that China's economy entered a prolonged period of deflation after 2022. I also made 2 long-term predictions. First, that China is likely to experience another period of strong economic growth around 2036. And second, that after 2040, the country would enter an even deeper and more prolonged period of deflation and economic stagnation. Today, we are going to test this framework using Japan. We'll examine Japan's economic and demographic trends to see whether changes in working age population can explain the country's long period of weak growth and deflation. More importantly, we'll ask whether this same indicator can help us understand where Japan's economy is headed next. If the evidence supports this theory, then Japan's long-term outlook may be far less optimistic than many people expect. Some of you may be watching my channel for the first time, so let me briefly explain what I mean by WAP. In my research, WAP stands for the net change in the working age population, specifically people between the ages of 20 and 60. In other words, it measures how many people enter the workforce each year minus how many people leave it. The simplest way to calculate this is straightforward. You start with the number of people turning 20 in a given year and subtract the number of people turning 60. The number of people turning 20 this year is roughly equal to the number of babies born 20 years ago, after adjusting for infant and childhood mortality. Likewise, the number of people turning 60 is based on the number of babies born 60 years ago, again adjusted for mortality. In practice, however, the calculation is a little more complicated. People's working lives don't stay the same forever. In Japan, for example, the average age at which young people enter the workforce has been pushed back by about 1 year since the early 1990s, because more students are attending college. At the same time, the retirement age has been raised several times and is now roughly 3 years later than it used to be. So, if you want a more accurate measure of the working age population, you need to adjust for both delayed entry into the labor force and delayed retirement. I'm not going to walk through all the math here because it's fairly technical, but after making those adjustments, I was able to calculate Japan's annual net change in its working age population. That's the red line you are seeing on the chart. There's one more factor we need to consider, and that's immigration. Or more accurately in Japan's case, the inflow of foreign workers. Interestingly, Japan rarely describes this as immigration. Instead, the government prefers the term foreign workers because Japan has traditionally been reluctant to grant permanent residency or citizenship on a large scale. For many years, the number of foreign workers entering Japan was so small that it barely affected the data, but that changed after 2013 and especially after 2015, when the inflow accelerated dramatically. So I used Japan's official statistics on long-term foreign residents to calculate the annual net increase in foreign workers and added that figure to the domestic WAP calculation. The result is the blue line. As you can see, before 2000, the blue and the red lines are almost identical because immigration was negligible. But beginning around 2013, and even more noticeably after 2015, the blue line rises well above the red line, showing that foreign workers increasingly offset Japan's shrinking domestic workforce. Take 2024 as an example. Japan's native working age population declined by about 470,000 people. However, the country added nearly 360,000 foreign workers, offsetting most of that decline. That's a surprisingly large number. To put into perspective, only about 1.12 million Japanese citizens reached working age that year, which means the inflow of foreign workers was roughly one-third of the size of Japan's new domestic labor force. Now let me show you a chart that most people find completely counterintuitive. If you watched my previous video, you've already seen it, but it's worth looking at it again because the result is so surprising. Most people instinctively assume that if working age population shrinks, there will be fewer people competing for jobs, so finding a job should become easier and unemployment should fall. On the other hand, if the working age population suddenly increases, for example, because a country accepts a large number of foreign immigrants, then job competition should become more intense and unemployment should rise. That sounds perfectly reasonable, doesn't it? In fact, that's one of the most common arguments people make against immigration. But when you look at Japan's data, the exact opposite happens. The blue line shows Japan's working age population, and the brown line shows the unemployment rate. As working age population declines, unemployment actually rises. And when the working age population increases, unemployment falls. The two lines move in opposite directions. So why does this happen? I explained this in my previous video, but it's worth repeating because it's the key idea behind my entire framework. The mistake people make is that they only see the supply of labor. They see more young workers entering the labor market, but they forget that those same people create more new demand. Young adults don't just work, they start families, rent or buy homes, purchase cars, buy furniture, eat out, travel, and spend money on almost everything. Imagine a young worker earning $100,000 a year in a city where the average home costs $1 million. To buy that house, maybe they put down $200,000 of their own savings and borrow the remaining $800,000 from a bank. Then they spend another $100,000 renovating the house and another $40,000 buying a car. Altogether, that one person has created $1.14 million of demand. Think about what that means. $1.14 million in spending can support the annual salaries of roughly 11 workers earning $100,000 a year. That's the economic power of a single young household. And this doesn't stop after people turn 40. As they move into middle age, they often upgrade to larger homes, buy better cars, renovate their properties, and continue spending. So when a country's working age population keeps growing, total demand keeps expanding, businesses keep hiring, incomes keep rising, and the economy can even overheat. But when the working age population begins to shrink, those purchases become less frequent. Businesses sell less, investment slows, incomes stagnate, and the economy drifted into deflation and recession. This is why I believe we need to rethink one of the most common misconceptions about immigration. If our goal is a stronger, a more prosperous economy, then we shouldn't fear immigration, we should welcome it. Now let's compare Japan's working-age population with another important indicator, real GDP per capita growth. This is real GDP, which means inflation has already been removed. So it reflects changes in actual economic output rather than changes in prices, and is measured per person, not for the economy as a whole. Real GDP per capita is one of the best proxies for changes in average living standards and average income. It tells us whether ordinary people are actually becoming richer or poorer. Now let's put these two series on the same chart. The result is striking. As you can see, they move remarkably closely together. When the working-age population rises, real GDP per capita growth tends to rise as well, and when the working-age population declines, economic growth also tends to slow. Visually, the relationship is already quite obvious, but we can also test it statistically. If we calculate the correlation coefficient, we get a value of about 0.7. A correlation of 1 means two variables move perfectly together. A correlation of 0 means there's no linear relationship at all. So a correlation of 0.7 is very strong. We can go one step further and run a simple linear regression. The results show that changes in the working-age population explain about 50% of the variation in Japan's real GDP per capita growth. That's an extraordinarily high number. Economic growth is affected by countless forces: government policies, tax reforms, monetary policy, global economic conditions, oil prices, financial crisis, technological change, and many others. Yet all of these factors combined explain only about half of the fluctuations in growth. The other half can be explained simply by changes in the working-age population. That is why I argue that the net change in the working-age population is the single most important variable driving long-term economic growth. Now let's take a closer look at Japan's data. Before 1994, Japan's annual net change in the working-age population was generally positive. During the 1960s and 1970s, the increase was especially large. Even throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, it remained mostly positive or only slightly negative. But one year really stands out, 1986. You can see this sharp drop in the chart. In that year, the working-age population fell by about 460,000 people. And interestingly, real GDP per capita growth also shows a sharp decline at exactly the same time. That probably isn't a coincidence. So what happened? The answer goes back exactly 20 years to 1966, when Japan experienced an extraordinary collapse in births. As a result, 20 years later, far fewer young people entered the workforce. But why did births collapse in 1966? Believe it or not, the reason had nothing to do with economics. It was superstition. According to the traditional Chinese zodiac calendar, 1966 was the year of fire horse. There was a widespread belief in Japan that girls born in a fire horse year would grow up to be stubborn, difficult, and bring bad luck to their husbands. As unbelievable as it sounds today, many couples postpone having children simply because of that superstition. One irrational belief changed the birth patterns, and 20 years later it quietly showed up as a measurable slowdown in economic growth. It's a fascinating example of how demographic shocks can echo through an economy decades after they first occur. After 1994, however, the story changed completely. Japan's annual net change in the working-age population turned constantly negative, and the decline became larger year after year, By around 2004, the annual loss had reached roughly 710,000 people, equivalent to about 1% of Japan's entire workforce. That's an enormous demographic shock. Not surprisingly, these were also some of the most difficult years of the Japanese economy, the period most people associated with the aftermath of the real estate bubble and the so-called lost decades. Richard Koo famously argued that Japan's prolonged stagnation was caused by a balance sheet recession. After the property bubble burst, households and businesses were left with heavy debts while the value of their assets collapsed. Instead of borrowing and investing, they focused on paying down debt, causing demand to remain weak for many years. I believe that explanation is an important part of the story, but that is not the whole story. At the same time that the private sector was deleveraging, Japan was also losing hundreds of thousands of working-age people every single year. That shrinking workforce wasn't just another factor. It was a fundamental force pushing the economy towards slower growth and persistent deflation. Then something interesting happened. Around 2004, 2005, and 2006, Japan suddenly showed signs of a surprisingly strong recovery. In his book, Richard Koo celebrated this period as evidence that the balance sheet recession had finally ended and that policy stimulus had successfully pulled Japan out of the deflation. But if you look at the demographic data, there's another explanation. The people retiring around 2005 and 2006 were born in 1945 and 1946. The final and most difficult years of World War II. Births during those years were exceptionally low, which meant that unusually few people reached retirement age 6 decades later. As a result, Japan's annual net change in the working-age population improved dramatically, even briefly turning positive after several years of steep declines. In other words, the labor force stopped shrinking as rapidly, and the economy immediately becomes much stronger. The long-term trend remains remarkably consistent. When the working-age population improves, economic growth strengthens. When it deteriorates, growth weakens. After 2013, and especially after 2015, something important changed. Japan began bringing in foreign workers in a much larger scale, and almost all of those workers were young adults of working age. You can see it clearly in the chart. From 2015 onward, the blue line starts pulling away from the red line. Remember, the red line represents the annual net change in Japan's native working age population. The gap between the blue line and the red line is the contribution from foreign workers. Now look at Japan's real GDP per capita growth. Instead of following the red line, it begins tracking the blue line much more closely. That tells us something very important. Without this large inflow of young foreign workers, Japan's economy would almost actually have performed much worse. In fact, it might have remained trapped in an even deeper and longer period of stagnation. Just look at what happens to the red line after 2018. It drops sharply and keeps falling, reflecting the rapid decline of Japan's native workforce. The only reason the overall working-age population doesn't collapse at the same pace is because the foreign workers are lifting the blue line. In other words, they are helping support Japan's labor force, and in doing so, they are helping support Japan's economy growth. You may also notice a brief spike in the red line around this period. That's because the unusually small birth cohort of 1966 finally reached retirement age. Since fewer people were retiring that year, the decline in the working-age population temporarily became much smaller. Japan's response to this demographic crisis is also fascinating because it reveals the tension between economics and culture. Culturally, Japan has long been one of the most reluctant countries in the developed world when it comes to immigration. Yet policymakers, economists, and government officials recognized the demographic problem decades ago. As early as the 1990s, official government reports were already warning that Japan would eventually need foreign workers to offset its shrinking labor force. The problem was political. Immigration was a highly sensitive issue. Japanese politicians understood that openly calling for large-scale immigration would provoke strong public resistance. So instead of using the word immigration, they created new labels. One example was the Technical Intern Training Program. The name makes it sound as though young foreigners were simply coming to Japan to learn new skills before returning home. But in reality, many Japanese companies relied on the program as a major source of labor. Later came the Specified Skilled Worker Visa. From the name, you might assume it was designed for highly specialized professionals. In reality, most of these workers were employed in ordinary blue-collar jobs such as elderly care, construction, agriculture, food services, and manufacturing. The word skilled was largely a political choice. It made the policy sound more acceptable to the public, even though its real purpose was to bring in workers to fill labor shortages. The turning point came under Shinzo Abe. Most people remember Abe for Abenomics and its famous 3 arrows in economic policy. But in my view, one of his most important and perhaps most underappreciated achievements was dramatically expanding Japan's supply of young foreign workers. Beginning around 2015, the inflow accelerated rapidly. Annual admissions gradually increased from just tens of thousands to well over 100,000, then 200,000, and eventually 300,000 foreign workers a year. Those workers became one of the key reasons the Japanese economy performed better than its domestic demographic trend alone would have predicted. As more young foreign workers entered Japan, the economy began to recover. Inflation, which Japan had been desperately trying to achieve for decades, finally returned. And beginning around 2015, housing prices also started climbing again after years of weakness. You can see that clearly in this housing price chart. Demographics don't explain everything, of course, but they provide a powerful foundation for understanding why Japan's economy finally regained some momentum. Unfortunately, at exactly the same time, Japan has experienced a growing wave of populism, and one of its central themes is opposition to immigration. Anti-immigrant sentiment has become increasingly influential in Japanese politics and society. You've probably seen some recent examples in the news. 2 young Chinese tourists dancing outside a Lawson convenience store early in the morning became the target of a massive outlying backlash from nationalist groups. There was also the case of an Indian worker whose visa was revoked after spending nearly 30 years in Japan. In an emotional interview, he said, "I worked here for 3 decades. I bought a home here. My children don't even speak Indian languages anymore. And now you are telling me to leave." Whether or not you agree with every individual case, stories like these remind us that immigrants' policies affect real human lives. More recently, Japan's government has moved to tighten immigration rules and make long-term residency more difficult. From an economic perspective, however, I believe Japan ultimately risks hurting itself. Look at the demographic projections. Over the next 20 years, Japan is expected to lose somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million working-age people every year. If the inflow of foreign work slows significantly, there will be very little to offset the decline. In that scenario, Japan could once again find itself trapped in a prolonged period of weak growth and deflation. Within just a few years, businesses could begin facing more severe labor shortages, weaker consumer demand, and slower economic growth. I'd like to end with one broader observation. Public opinion and economic reality are often very different things. Voters naturally respond to emotions, personal experiences, and cultural concerns. But political leaders have a responsibility to look beyond the short-term public sentiment. Instead of simply amplifying popular fears in order to win elections, they should explain the economic trade-offs honestly and guide society toward policies that strengthen long-term prosperity. In the next episode, I will apply this same working-age population framework to the United States. We will examine what America's demographic trends are telling us, and what they may imply for the US economy over the next several years. If you are interested in the future of American and global economy, you won't want to miss this. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.